online lecture series, lecture number 7, Causes and Consequences of World War I. As a foreword, I just want to say I do not own the rights to any music or images in this video. All are used for educational purposes, not with the intent of generating profit. World War I, Causes and Consequences. At its time, World War I was the largest and bloodiest conflict in human history, and had its roots deep in European history and had been building up for decades. Nearly 10 million would die in this conflict, most from infections and disease, although the new industrialized weaponry such as the machine gun and chemical weapons would prove to be mortally devastating. As you may recall, there were 4 main causes to World War I: a complicated alliance system, and the isms: imperialism, nationalism, and militarism. Alliances in Europe. Now this is perhaps the most complicated cause of World War I, so please stay with me on this. Serbia and Bosnia, 2 small countries on the Adriatic Sea just north of Greece, had only recently gained independence from their former master, the Ottoman Empire. Shortly after winning independence, however, the Austria-Hungary Empire threatened to gobble up these small nations. Serbians and Bosnians were none too thrilled with this prospect, as you can imagine, so when a relative of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary was touring the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo in July of 1914, a radical, anti-imperialist faction known as the Black Hand plotted action. 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Black Hand, led the assassination of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Angered at this, Austria demanded that Serbia, where the Black Hand was headquartered, open its borders to Austrian forces in order to investigate and persecute the Black Hand. Serbia refused, fearing conquest, and a war broke out between a tiny nation and a dying empire. Now note, World War I was started by a teenager, so I don't ever want to hear what teenagers can or cannot accomplish in this world. Now in theory, this should have been a very short war. However, Serbia had an ace up its sleeve. Serbia had signed an alliance with the Russian Empire. Linked by a common ethnic heritage, both nations were heavily Slavic. Russia promised to defend its little brother if it were ever attacked. So when Austria began its assault against Bosnia and Serbia, Russia declared war. Now this is where it starts to get complicated. Germany was a close ally of Austria's, so it in turn honored its alliance and declared war against Russia. Russia, however, had further allies, England and France. England, intimidated by Germany's growing navy, had signed a mutual defense pact with the Russians. France, who had once tried to invade Russia a century earlier under Napoleon, had signed treaties with both Russia and England, so it was in the war, as they also feared Germany's growing might. Further, the Ottoman Empire, who had just recently lost a great deal of territory around the Black Sea to Russia, also wanted revenge, so it joined Austria and Germany in the war. So, in late July, what had seemingly started in 1914 as a small squabble over an assassinated member of Austria's royal family, within a matter of weeks had expanded to engulf the European continent. Imperialism. Now, what truly made this war global, however, was the fact that nearly every large European nation had colonial possessions, principally in Africa and Asia. These colonies provided Europeans with enormous wealth through raw materials for use in factories and industry, precious resources such as gold and diamonds, and millions of indigenous inhabitants to whom those products could in turn be sold. As a result of the financial gain colonies could provide, Europeans competed heavily for control of nations throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Border skirmishes and small wars were common as one nation tried to take over its neighbor. When World War I broke out, not only did colonies labor to provide material resources to their colonizers, they also provided soldiers. India, Japan, and virtually the entire African continent sent soldiers to the fight. Nationalism. Nationalism added fuel to the tensions that erupted in Europe during August of 1914. Each nation was fiercely nationalistic, believing that not only was it superior to all others, but all other nations were therefore naturally inferior. Patriotic hymns extolling the virtues of each country were sung everywhere, from churches to bars to classrooms, instilling within each nation's citizens a fierce, loyal love for their country. Propaganda papered the sides of buildings, subways, and train stations, spreading national pride and hatred for other nations. Militarism. The final ingredient that brought World War I to a boil was militarism. Going hand in hand with nationalism, militaristic countries, and nearly all nations in Europe were fiercely militaristic at this time, glorified their armed forces and war. The most honorable pursuit for a young man was glory on the battlefield. The most glorious death was to be had in fighting the enemy. Courtesy of industrialization, nations such as Germany and England spent enormous amounts of their national treasury on expanding and building up their armed forces at a time when the world was supposed to be at peace. When the glorification of war and the military are combined with a strong sense of national pride and prejudice against other nations, competitions for overseas colonial possessions, and a very tangled web of alliances, it's not hard to see why on August 1st, 1914, the world broke out into war. Fighting World War I. As mentioned earlier, the Industrial Revolution had some significant bloody consequences concerning how wars in the 20th century would be fought. Mechanization meant that machine guns, submarines, airplanes, ships, artillery, and shells could be produced at a lightning-fast pace for the millions who enlisted or were drafted into each nation's army. These weapons also meant that the traditional style of fighting wars, by having armies face off and fire at each other in columns until only one remained standing, were also a relic of the past. One machine gun alone would be able to decimate entire columns of soldiers by firing hundreds of rounds per minute. As a result, trench warfare became the principal method of fighting, especially on the Western Front between France and Germany. Deep trenches, miles long, were dug deeply into the soil. Each side would lob hundreds of thousands of pounds of explosives at the enemy's trench in hope of decimating their numbers. Meanwhile, soldiers on each side would wait for the whistle to signal them to jump up out of the trench, sprint across no man's land between the trenches, and try to overtake the opponent's trench. Such attempts were rarely successful, most often littering no man's land with thousands of corpses. Adding in the terror that chemical weapons such as chlorine and mustard gas created, it soon became apparent that the fighting in World War I would be anything but noble. Death came more often than not at the hands of infections and diseases, as countless armies of rats, lice, and mosquitoes would plague trenches on either side throughout the war. Death was always uncertain, it could never be predicted. With no way to defend against mortar attacks from above, the rats from below, and the machine gunners who faced you a mile away, most soldiers quickly learned just how sweet and proper it was to die for one's country indeed.